Hello and welcome to the Bestseller Experiment, where we continue to discover what makes a bestseller and inspire you to start, finish, and publish your book. I'm Mark DeVoe.
And I am Mark Stay, and this episode is brought to you, as always, by our sponsors, who are the people who support this podcast. They can do it via the Bestseller Academy. They can do it via Patreon. And to welcome our new patron this week, Donica Krieg. I hope I got that right, Donica. Welcome to you. Can everyone make room for Donica at the back? There we go. It's getting quite crowded in here. There are lots of people supporting us on Patreon who getting those deep dives, access to episodes early, and all sorts of good stuff. So do check it out. Mr. D, how are you, sir?
I'm very excited, Mark, because at the time of recording, in about when this episode goes live in about 11 hours or so, we're going to be doing a live webinar.
Oh, yes, we will, won't we?
On the importance of accountability. And it really is. I'll tell you what, we've been doing this for a while now, but I'm really starting to suss this one out. That one of the biggest challenges we've got as writers is accountability. How do we get up in the morning and write something when there's no one waiting there for this manuscript or this, traditional publisher saying, where's the book you promised us 16 months ago? When we're writing on our own, it's absolutely impossible to be self-motivated and to go through all of those ups and downs that we all struggle with as writers. So we're going to be doing a special webinar on this and how you can create accountability in your writing year, your writing month, your writing week, and your writing day. And if you're listening to this and thinking, oh no, I've missed it, 'cause it's on the 21st of June, 2021. If you've missed it and you think, oh no, I really wanted to listen to that. If you register, you go to academy.bestsellerexperiment.com, you can register for the webinar and watch the replay. So if you've missed it, you can still watch it. It'll be up for a week or so. And the Academy closes on the end of June. So starting 1st of July. So if you're interested in joining the Academy, get in. We're running out of spaces, folks. But if you've been hearing us banging on about this for a while, there is a reason why. It's absolutely amazing. And so Mr. Stay, you've had a week and a half. You've had book launches, book fairs, all kinds.
Yeah, it's I've recorded a couple of things for the London Book Fair. So if after seeing our wonderful seminar and you get a taste for it, you want a bit more, there's a couple of things I'm doing at the London Book Fair. So I'm doing a thing called Quick Slow, which is about how technology has affected my writing year with a few other people. So I'll be talking about it from the perspective of a writer. We've got Simon Appleby, who made my Witches of Woodville website. He'd be talking about tech and how it's changed and how he's been working with writers over the last year. We've got Hermione Island, who runs the Academy Divan, which is a small specialist publisher. And it's all being chaired by Justine Solomons, who's been a guest on the podcast as well, as has Simon. Did a lovely deep dive with Simon on author websites, and Justine did a lovely deep dive on networking, which if you're a patron, you can get access to those, so do check that out. And then so that's going to be on the 23rd of June. On 29th of June, I'm chairing a panel on the art of crime writing, in which I talked to a friend of the podcast, Mark Edwards, and friends to be of the podcast, Abby Silver and RJ McBride, who hopefully will both be coming on the podcast at some point in the future, because that's what happens when I chat to people. I say, come on the podcast. And we'll be talking about how to keep readers engaged through the twists and turns of a crime story, and that's on the 29th of June. But all this info, all the nitty gritty, if you want to find out more, just go to londonbookfair.co.uk. You can register and check it out. And it's all good fun. It's all good fun. But,
and here's a lesson for everyone about persistence and trying hard. I mean, when we started this podcast, 5 years ago nearly, we were just lowly people. There was Mr. Stay scribbling. He had a little movie that came out, but not much had happened in his life. Now, chairing London Book Fair. Chairing a London book. I mean, Mr. Stay.
I'm not the chairman of the London Book Fair. Let me make that absolutely clear.
Yeah. That's just one step away, though, isn't it? Really, I mean, but chairing a panel,
world domination.
Absolutely, you better watch out. But that's brilliant. That's really exciting news, and I'm very. I mean, Mark Edwards, one of my favourite guests.
Oh, we love him.
Brilliant.
He's
great.
We love him.
If you didn't listen to Mark's episode, that was in the now infamous season 1. um, which people still binge. But if you haven't listened to that one, I really enjoyed that one because it really opened my eyes to the idea of the hybrid author and the way that Mark had kind of done both and tried a bit of both. And, a real sage in this world of what very rapidly changing publishing industry, but it feels like it's been happening for years, really.
Well, the thing, I'll put a link in the show notes to listen to the Mark Edwards one, because the other big thing we talked about with Mark was online book launches, which when we first spoke to Mark was a bit of he was a bit of an outlier. It was all new, whereas, it's the norm now. So, just last night, I did a wonderful book launch with Queeve McDonald, and we got some great news about Queeve at the end of the show, which we're going to talk about as well. But yeah, that was, we're using StreamYard, and it's all very slick and smooth. Here's a little connection for you. We had music at the end from Ronan McManus, who is the brother of a neighbour of yours. Doesn't Elvis Costello live in your neck of the woods?
Literally 15 minutes away. Yeah. Me and Elvis, so his brother like Ronan. We are. Yeah. No, I think actually, if Elvis is listening, actually, if Elvis hasn't left the building, I really want to meet up with Elvis because he's a Liverpool fan and I'm a Liverpool fan as well. And there's a few of us that have formed this kind of like support group out here where we all get together and watch games. So I'll be reporting down the road about my adventures of watching a football game with Elvis. That'd just be very random.
Excellent.
Very, very random. So
Make it happen. Make it happen.
Yeah, it's just for fun.
Yeah. So it's a good evening. Yeah.
Brilliant stuff. Well, we've got tons to talk about, but I actually really want to dive into our interview this week, Mark, because this is a brilliant interview. Let's do an intro to the amazing Joe Thomas.
Yes, Joe Thomas was born in Hackney, London, but lived in São Paulo, Brazil between 2002 and 2012 before returning to London. And his time there led to the São Paulo Quartet, which is Paradise City, a Gringa, a Playboy, and now Brazilian Psycho, the final book in the quartet. We talk about how Joe takes the reality of Sao Paulo's crime, corruption, and culture to create vivid and engaging fiction, how living there gave him an insight that he might not otherwise have had. We discuss his early unpublished novels, what he learned from them, how his writing habits have evolved now that he has a family, and much, much more.
Excellent. So let's dive in and listen to Mark chatting with the wonderful Joe Thomas.
Joe Thomas, welcome to the Bestseller Experiment. How are you today, sir?
I'm very well, thank you. How are you? I'm delighted to be talking to you.
I'm very good, very good. Thank you very much. We're here to talk about Brazilian Psycho, which is the final book in the São Paulo Quartet. And this book takes place over 15 years. It incorporates real-life crimes, the complex politics of Brazil, poverty, corruption, rebellions, serial killers, cover-ups. Already, I'm imagining a very, very tangled web. But this is something you've already done, at least 3 times before with great success. How do you even begin to shape all of that story noise into a narrative?
It's a good question. and in fact, it's something that has progressed across the series of novels, the quartet of novels. The first 3 books, Paradise City, Gringa, and Playboy, take place over a short period of time, but relate to a much bigger period, if that makes sense. So they're they take place over a week or a few days, a couple of weeks. I can't even remember exactly, but all of them refer to events much broader, real life events and sort of social issues, perhaps you might say, in Brazil. And when I came to conceiving of the final part of the quartet, which is also, just to note, a very good place to start because it goes back. It begins 7 or 8 years before book 1 and then ends after book 3. But only the final part is beyond that. So in fact, if people are looking for a way into the quartet, this is actually kind of introduces and completes it. And I talked to my editor about a way of sort of topping and tailing the series and trying to capture that sort of bigger thread that runs through across that period of time. And it's no coincidence that it begins on 2003 on the 1st of January when Lula was elected president or inaugurated as president, the socialist president of the country, and ends 16 years later when Bolsonaro is inaugurated as now his tragic presidency. And the novel was an attempt to, Brazilian Psycho particularly, but the quartet as a whole, is an attempt how that social change, that political change occurred, and how to do that through a crime narrative, because of course crime enables you to unpeel kind of the layers of a place. It allows access. A detective character, can reach the highest and lowest parts of society in different parts. And so that's what it was. What it was about really was about trying to tell the story of the city. The tangled web, as you say, is somewhat demonstrative of the place. It is a very complex and difficult place, but also a vibrant and exciting place. And I hope that alongside the kind of darkness of the novel and the kind of horror of much of corruption, police corruption, brutality, that kind of element that we see in Brazil. Only the other day there was a very tragic occurrence occurred in the favela in Rio, which is obviously a different city. But I wanted to, alongside that, to try to also capture something of that vibrancy and excitement of the city. And I hope that that's something that comes through in the novels.
It's interesting that a friend of a friend is Brazilian, and on Facebook, you read about these things in the news and they're appalling, but until you hear how it directly affects someone, it doesn't become real in a way, and it becomes a human story. So tell us about the characters in your stories and how they kind of give face to some of the things that have gone on in Sao Paulo in Brazil.
I think it might be a good way of doing that would be to sort of talk an anecdote of how the novel, the whole series really came from, and it relates exactly to what you're describing, and then I'll kind of link that to the characters afterwards, if that's okay. When I was living in Sao Paulo, in which I did for just about 10 years, in May 2006, there was a Mother's Day weekend, the Friday, the Sunday, a big deal in the country, and on the Friday afternoon, the international school where I worked, which is a British international school, some news of an attack, staff, mainly Brazilian staff. And we were sitting, it was at 3:00 after classes were just finishing up, and these rumors kind of filtered around, and we wondered what kind of attack that might be. Could it be a terrorist attack? This is obviously 2006. What shape or form would this take? We were told to go home early, or at least to leave then. I mean, it wasn't that early, but it was still early. And on the drive home, I remember seeing a couple of burnt out buses on a major road, which would normally be very busy at that time, but was empty. I remember seeing smoke dotted about. And I remember having that kind of sense of the post, a kind of apocalyptic landscape. It felt like kind of Blade Runner or something. The idea of this huge city that had suddenly stopped, and yet there was some ominous feeling, but no one was quite sure what it was. I got home over the weekend. I spent behind the gates in the condominium where I lived with Paulistano men playing tennis and eating barbecue, determined not for their weekend not to be disrupted. But what had happened was the major drug gang, the major gang in Sao Paulo, and one of the two major gangs in Brazil had requested flat screen televisions for their prison cells to watch the World Cup, which of course was 2006, the Football World Cup. And this request had been denied by the authorities, and as a result, they caused some chaos, as they put it. They were going to mess up the city. So what turned into a full-on rebellion, in which the sort of foot soldiers of the gang that were not in prison went to war with the military police. And over 3 days, there were about 160 people were killed, many in a kind of tit for tat scenario between military police and gang members. Some caught in the crossfire, obviously, tragically. There was a whole series, and the city was kind of shut down. And it was a very, very strange experience to be both in this place, very close to one of the favelas where there was activity, and yet desensitized by the condominium experience of living, but to know it was existing. On the Monday morning, going back to school, the headmaster, he'd been speaking to the chief of police, whose son studied at the school. It was a very exclusive school, very rich and important figures. His son went there or goes there, for example. And the chief of police had told the headmaster that officers were able to claim danger money if they'd been shot at or attacked in some way over this weekend. And so it turned out that many officers were shooting at their own police stations and vehicles to create evidence that they'd been shot at in order to claim this danger money. So this was one of those moments when you think, I mean, this is an extraordinary thing to hear and to have seen, and yet again there's that slight distance, and that's something that's interesting about Sao Paulo, is that crime is normalized, violent crime is normalized, and yet because of the inequality of society, if you are in that sort of higher echelon, you're protected, sanitized from it. So that and I felt that sort of that kind of brazenness of the request of the gang, the response, the brutal response of the military police, and then the seemed to me a very, very extraordinary weekend that I'd lived through, but not exactly been a part of, and that was the starting point really for the quartet. But I only wrote about that weekend in Brazilian Psycho, and what I've done and how I've done that is to look at the favela in which one of the key favelas in the city, Paraisópolis, which translated as Paradise City, a legal aid lawyer who works in there, a detective character, a member of the military police who appears to be a decent person, and then a favela kid who is a sort of messenger for the drug gang. So kind of multiple perspective for that particular scene, and this weekend is the kind of final point of the first, maybe third or half of the novel, and researching it further, it wasn't as simple as that rather playful sound element that I said at the beginning. The drug gang whose leaders are in prison want to watch the World Cup. It was a lot murkier than that, and a lot more complicated, and a lot more frightening. So it was a really interesting experience for me to research it 12 years later, let's say 10 to 12 years later, properly look into the documents and see what really had happened, and try to piece that together with my own narrative of it too. So those elements of fear, danger, and corruption, you tell these stories, and they can sound almost quaint, or the corruption foreign very much from a British perspective, and then you look at what the UK has become, and you think what an arrogant position to look at South America as a sort of corrupt country when we're run by a corrupt government, for example. But anyway, that was again something that come out in the last few years in my mind, that sense of Brazil it is a more violent society. There are extremes of visceral extremes, but it's the same issues that we experience here, and I hope that Brazilian Psycho will resonate with British and readers beyond American or English language. I'm thinking at this point, because of that shift from liberal to populist, perhaps. Yeah, sorry, that was a very long answer.
No, it's very good, very good. You lived in Sao Paulo for 10 years, as you said, which will give you, an incredible insight to its culture and politics. But as you say, it is incredibly complex. How long was it before you felt that you could write about the place and the people and its culture with the confidence to be published? Because, it's one of these things that you are still an outsider looking in, but you were embedded there for 10 years. When came the point where you thought, okay, I can write about this?
It was when I came back, actually, and it was partly to make sense of the place, and understanding that the place I suppose, the first thing I tried to write about the city was a kind of a city novel, which I called it Sao Paulo, and I thought the way to write about a city of that size, scale, and complexity would be to have sort of 12 narratives and try to capture all these different voices. And it was a long, and I think in the end it helped me get an agent. It didn't get published, and I now look back and I can see why, but I've mined it since then. But one of the narratives I wrote was the detective narrative, the character, and and his story, or that narrative, that character became the protagonist in the first book, Paradise City. So to answer your question, there were two things that happened. One, I came back to London, I came home and wanted to make sense of the place, not so much my experience, but of the place where I lived. And secondly, I realized that the best way to tell that was to take a very, very, very single, certainly in the first book, a single point of view narrative, and try to filter the place through this character. And once I realized that was the effective way of doing it, rather than having this kind of multiple perspectives, that then led me to experimenting in the next books. And Brazilian Psycho has a large cast of characters, but it was that revelation. Oh yeah, you don't need a huge cast to do justice to the place. And that came after about a year or so of writing about the place, which was a couple of years after I left. So there was that, and then the second realization was the understanding that I felt like there was a rigor to the research and approach, and the desire to root the series in real life structures, if not real life events too. And the continued conversations I had with Brazilian friends were helpful. And then finally these books are very much about the city of Sao Paulo. Obviously the title Brazilian Psycho, they are focused on that city. My knowledge of the rest of Brazil is scant, but I do have a good understanding of how the city of Sao Paulo works. But of course that's changing now, and yeah, I feel I don't feel confident that I'd write any more about the city, and I'm very happy to have been given the opportunity to create this document, which again is very much from an outsider's eyes, but also outsider is the way I kind of look at it after that experience.
Paradise City, which was published, I believe, in 2017, is the first book in the quartet. Was it always going to be a quartet? I mean, you've been compared a number of times to James Ellroy, and he's had various, the LA Quartet. That's pretty ambitious. Did you ever doubt that you could pull it off? Were you thinking, oh gosh, I wish I'd made this a duology or just one book? Were there any? What was it like being at the foot of the mountain?
There were two. Well, originally I had the idea of a quartet in mind, and that was because of, you mentioned James Ellroy, but also David Peace, the Red Riding Quartet.
Yeah,
I liked the idea, frankly, of a thing that is complete. Much as I admire, say, Ian Rankin or Val McDermid, I find detective series less satisfying to read as a document, if that makes sense. Mm-hmm. You can go and read the Red Riding Quartet, and you've had that experience. You can read the Ellroy trilogy, the Ellroy Quartet. Yeah. And there is that sense too, and perhaps it's that. I mean, as I said, I've read a whole number of Ian Rankin's Rebus novels, and I think they're all terrific. But I always worry, when am I going to finish? And that's a selfish perspective from a reader. As a reader. So the starting point was that I'd like to try to fashion something in which I can feel it has depth and weight and authority, but also is there. So that ambition came from my thoughts as a reader. Then what happened, of course, is that the publishing world isn't always a straightforward one. On a practical level, and you talked about listeners or watchers being writers, so people will not understand this completely. I was originally offered a 2-book deal for the first 2, and I was hopeful that I would get the opportunity to complete it. But it came in 2 stages. I then did single book deals, so for Playboy, and then Psycho. In between, I published a novel called Bent, which is a standalone novel set in Soho in the 1960s, and behind the lines in the war for SAS operations, which is slightly different.
Yes.
But in actual fact, the reality of the publishing world, meaning I wasn't given a 4-book deal at the beginning, but I did have in mind what I wanted to do, meant that I took some time to think about how Playboy and then Brazilian Psycho would be shaped. Basically, Paradise City and Gringo were written pretty much when the deal was originally was done. Playboy I started, then shelved, wrote the other novel, Bent. And then when I came back to it, I understood I wanted to do something else. So that time was really valuable. And then with Brazilian Psycho, as I said earlier, that sense of topping and tailing and producing a grand sort of scale, that wasn't something I'd necessarily thought of before. So on the one hand, it's terrifying, and terrifying might be too strong a word, but it's nerve-wracking when you're not sure if you're able to complete a project. But in fact, it worked out very well for me in the end, because it gave me that time to consider how to do that. And if there had been just simply been a 4-book deal, I don't think Brazilian Psycho would look like it does, and I'm really, really proud of it. I don't think Playboy would either. That's a short sort of almost pulpy novel, but with a political backdrop. And I was, so that was on the one hand, the uncertainty, on the other, it really made, I hope it's meant that the books are there is a progression across the four.
Excellent stuff. Let's go back to when you started, and you started writing in your 20s. And I saw somewhere mention of unfinished novels, and of course we're going to have a lot of listeners who are starting out and might have a few of those unfinished novels in a drawer. Did you ever think of, oh, I'm not cut out for this, or did you just keep going? What kept you writing?
So I did start writing, and I think the first thing I wrote was a kind of hopeless man in his 20s novel, and I did it really badly, and it is really difficult. These novels are both there was an abundant fewer now, I think, and when they're done well, they're great, aren't they? But the world doesn't need any more hapless male novels of that sort, I think. But it was interesting, and then I thought about writing historical fiction, and my grandfather was in the SAS. So I did a bunch in the war and the first lot. So I did a bunch of research for that and write what I thought was a fairly serviceable thriller set on the operation that he was in. But I look back and I realised it wasn't actually very thrilling. It was quite boring. But it did instill a sort of discipline of process, perhaps. And then a lot of that popped up in Bent when I got the chance to do that. So then I tried something else. But when I say they were unfinished in the sense they were unsatisfying. But what it came down to, I guess, in the end, the reason why I was writing enough to produce these words was because, pure and simple, it made me feel better. I wanted to do it. I liked the craft, the discipline, the sitting down, the carving out of time. The way I would compare it was, my brother is he used to do a lot of triathlons and Ironman competitions, that kind of thing. Not at level, but for fun. And if he trained on a day, he felt better for that day. And I kind of felt the same way with writing. And I also think that when I started in earnest, I was living in Brazil, and my life wasn't hugely satisfying for many reasons, which I won't go into. But to be able to sit down to find a quiet place in the condominium where I lived, outside for a half term or holiday periods, and focus on something that was making me feel good. That was a real valuable thing. And it wasn't until after doing that for a number of years that I thought, and then I realized I wanted to leave Sao Paulo as well. And again, there were personal reasons, but also the place too, and professional reasons. And I did a creative writing MA at Royal Holloway. I work in education. I now lecture in English Lit and creative writing. And although I taught literature, I never had a qualification. I thought this was a good way of combining an interest there was a critical part of it that would provide that qualification. And it seemed to me to be not just the perfect fusion of my professional and then kind of at that point hobby interests, but also a way of escaping a city and a situation I wanted to leave. And then I took a whole year to do that. And I was lucky. I was able to stay with my brother. I was in my early 30s. So I'd spent 10 years working, had money saved that I could live on. And I spent a year reading and writing. And then that became the novel that wasn't published. And the one after that was. So I think, I hope that answers the question. It was a desire to work, really, that kept me doing it.
Excellent. We're obsessed with writers' habits on this podcast, and you've mentioned that you're a lecturer, which must take up an awful lot of time. And if you're teaching writing day in, day out, how does that affect your sort of writing? Are you someone who writes every day, or do you, as you mentioned writing in half term? Is that something you just take a chunk of time and write then?
I try to write every day, or at least do some writing every day. The difference between teaching at university and teaching at school is that university teaching frees up an awful lot more time, actually. And part of the job as a lecturer is to be producing research. So you're justified in using that time. I work part-time there too. I think the best way to answer this question, I'm not hugely precious about the time. I am, and this has been this has changed too now for the better, because I now have a son who's only 20 months old, just about to turn that age. So I completed Brazilian Psycho in the first few months of his life, and then wrote another novel, which is the next one, in over the next year. And I've always been quite an efficient writer, as in, if I got 2 hours in the morning, I'll do the word counts, the 1,000 to 1,500 words I want to produce. And I won't need to sort of have a quiet space in the middle of nowhere for the whole day. I'm pretty focused. And then since having a child, that's sharpened, because of course, you really do have to. And it's been really interesting thinking about a young family where I now have, the three of us. And what's the best thing for the child? What's the best thing for your partner? So I've had to shift a little bit, perhaps, in my. I always thought the best time for me to write was first thing in the morning, but I'm finding actually that might not be true. So having those habits and the adapting of them is important. But also, I think for me, it's knowing that, I plan my work quite fairly carefully in my mind. I've got an idea of the big picture of a novel or a series of novels. I can do little bits of research. I research as I write. So I don't struggle to find something to do on a sort of daily basis for the book, even if it's reading a few paragraphs or figuring out a kind of a narrative structure or something. So that's how my habits are. Try to have habits.
As a lecturer, what's the most common challenge that faces your students, and how do you help them overcome it?
That's a good question. I'd say the most common, and obviously this is a generalization inevitably, might be the balancing of exposition with realism.
Right.
I teach a blend of courses, short story workshop, creative nonfiction, and some genre fiction too. But it's really across genres. You get the same kinds of questions coming up with the work, the same kinds of things. And I think sometimes it's showing students elegant ways of presenting information. That's one challenge within that dialogue, for example. So it's trying to show students, especially with fiction, especially with, and creative nonfiction, but that sense of what is it that you want to present, and how do you do that in a way that is elegant, compelling within a narrative? And that, I think the most natural writers are the ones that somehow understand that you don't plonk the exposition at the beginning, and are always looking at ways of bringing in backstory or context in subtle and interesting ways. And I'd say that's a difficult problem for any writer, let alone a student in the first year doing a creative writing degree. So that's one thing. I'm really lucky. My students at Hertfordshire are great, and it's been a very difficult year, as you can imagine, teaching online, and for them especially. I mean, not for me necessarily. Although there have been challenges, but the way in which they have risen to those challenges in terms of writing about, for example, in the creative nonfiction modules, writing about their experiences of lockdown or the pandemic with warmth and humor and insight has been, for me, absolutely revelatory. It's lovely to read stuff like that. So, the key, this is not the question you asked, but as a lecturer and a teacher in any form, I think, and I've worked in a few different educational settings, that magic of learning from your students, if that is there, then the job is so rewarding, and you learn a lot as much. And that is, I've found that at university that has continued. It's perhaps more obvious at school level, especially when you're helping them get into the university, which was part of the job I did, because they're like, you've done that, and then they move on. At university, it feels like it feels like you're helping on a less tangible way, apart from the grades, but in a way that is equally satisfying, and that you learn so much from it. I'm better at writing for that. And I'm also very, very lucky, because the wonderful short story writer and novelist Lucy Caldwell is a close friend, and we have a first reader relationship. So my teaching of the short story has been hugely informed by reading drafts of hers, as well as. So these things are all, I think, it's all connected, isn't it? And I'm really lucky to be able to work doing the two things that I love most, professionally speaking, which is teaching and writing.
Fantastic. And what's next from? You mentioned a novel that had been completed. Is Brazil behind you now? Are you looking to more novels along the lines of Bent? What's coming up from you next, Joe?
Yeah, that's exactly right. Brazil is I'm not going to be writing anymore on Brazil. In fact, while we were talking, my agent's name just flashed up on my phone, which is pertinent because we're just negotiating. We're just working out the details of a new project with my publisher, the first novel of which is written, basically, which is running. I was born in Hackney in London, and I want to write about that period from 1978 to 1990 in 3 novels, which will provisionally be called White Riot, Red Menace, and True Blue. And the idea is that it's a sort of alternative history of the London Borough of Hackney through real life crime, looking at the rise and fall, at the period of the rise and fall of Thatcher, and then running a kind of countercultural protest / music element through it. That's the idea. Wow. And it is, so it begins at the Rock Against Racism concert in 1978 and ends at the poll tax riots. That's the overarching structure of the trilogy. And as I said, I'm kind of looking at editing the first book and inching my way into the second and waiting for the details to see if it all happens.
That sounds
nervously waiting for confirmation.
I grew up in Hornsey, so you can sign me up for that. Oh. You've sold 1 copy at least, so
they all count.
Thank you so much, Joe. Thanks so much for talking to us, and hope to speak to you again soon.
Yeah, thank you. I really enjoyed that. Thanks so much for the opportunity.
What are your writing dreams? Finishing that book, quitting the day job, becoming a best-selling author? Well, over 4 years, we've studied the advice of over 300 best-selling authors who've collectively sold over 500 million books. And we are excited to announce the Bestseller Academy. If you're ready to take your writing to the next level with accountability, craft, and coaching, your bestseller dreams are now only a click away. To find out more and apply, visit bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. That's bestsellerexperiment.com/academy. You can tell, Mark, can't you, that Joe is a natural storyteller, because when he started telling that story about prisons in Brazil and the World Cup, I was just absolutely enthralled. I just listened. I was like, oh my gosh, this is incredible.
Yeah. No, he and that's what comes from living there, I think. So, I mean, last week, listeners, we were talking to Damien Lewis, the historian, about researching into history and writing narrative nonfiction. But with Joe here, he takes real situations, very recent history and current affairs, of course, and creates a fiction around them. But instead of, talking to veterans and survivors of something, he's embedded himself in that place and its culture for a decade. So, that can't but help but rub off on your storytelling. And it's such a vivid and lively place. So that definitely informs the way that he tells his stories, I think.
Absolutely. If you've lived somewhere, you've experienced the full 5, maybe 6 senses of that environment, and you can't imagine that in your head. We have incredible imagination, but if you lived there, it's so authentic. And it's quite interesting because it reminded me of a story I once heard from a student I was working with, who said they were desperate to go to the place that they wanted to write about. And that was the reason why they never finished their book, because they never had actually gone and immersed themselves. And it was a block. And I actually think Joe reminded me of, write what you know. If you've lived it doesn't matter. I mean, Brazil's amazing because it's like for me anyway, it seems like such a foreign land and a different culture. And it's got all these incredible things that I can learn about it through Joe's books. But when people are using it as a reason not to write their book because they haven't been there, then go back in time. Where have you been? Where have you lived? And for Joe, obviously, he's great experience living there for 10 years. And it's no doubt made an incredible impact on his books.
I mean, I recall the conversation we had with Michelle Paver, who went halfway up a mountain in the Himalayas, if you recall. So
Yes.
that was, but obviously not all of us can afford or have the time or the luxury to do that. So yeah, I think it is, moving here to Kent, it's not quite as exotic as perhaps the Himalayas or Sao Paulo, but it has its own charms, But having moved here has definitely informed my books in a way that really surprises me. Just sitting there looking out that window and seeing the seasons change, and having become this amateur ornithologist as well, it has changed the way that I write, because I now do a nature pass on my books when I'm doing a draft. I make sure I kind of sprinkle a little bit local color on there. But I know we'll talk. We've mentioned Queeve once already, and we'll mention him again at the end. But I know there's a book that he wants to write that is set in Brooklyn. And he doesn't want to write it until he's been to Brooklyn and walked the streets and smelled the smells and all that kind of thing. And Ben Aronovich as well. Ben Aronovich, his books are all set in London. I think he said as much on the episode when we spoke to him. He said that he'd set them in London because he could step out of his door and jump on the tube and do his research right there and then. I think it was Natalie a couple of weeks ago.
Yeah,
who was,
I was just about to say, actually.
Talking about, same thing. London's on her doorstep. So
London's on her doorstep, but she also then
it's-
extended it to her kind of profession as well, about writing what she knows about working in law and being around crime. And so I think that, to me, that's such a huge thing. If you're stuck writing your book right now and you're just not really into it, you're not really feeling it, think about what you can bring into your book that you've personally experienced, that you have in-depth knowledge of, just not as a writer, but just because you've been a part of something. Whether it's the family kind of heritage, the upbringing that you had as a kid, whatever it is. That's, I think, where a lot of the juice lies.
It's all about discovering your own voice. And for so long, and I'm testament to this, for so long, when you're starting out, the temptation is to be like someone else. I've mentioned this before because I loved David Mamet, for example. I love David Mamet's plays and his rat-a-tat-tat dialogue and that kind of thing. I also love John Sullivan, who wrote Only Fools and Horses. So for a long time, certainly my early plays were this weird mishmash of these two cultures, these two halves of myself. And I was playing in other people's costumes. I was cosplaying, fancy dresses as those kind of people. And it took me a while just to relax and be myself. And it took quite a long time for me to get my head around that.
I find that fascinating you said that, Mark, because it kind of makes me think. We've talked. I always remember Joan Harris talking about how it took her third book to find her voice, and then that was her biggie, Chocolat. But what I found fascinating about what you just said is it kind of made me think. I wonder if our early voices are impressions, like we're mimicking our idols. Because let's be honest, what we talk about on the podcast constantly is why we show up to do this, why everyone should write a book, at least one book in their lifetime, is it could inspire one person or it could inspire millions. We don't know until we've written that book. But that's how it starts. We get inspired by someone else, and then we want to emulate what they've done. We want to be like them. We want to be their voice. We want to be the continuation of their voice, maybe. And then we maybe start out in this world where we're trying to be them. I mean, I know from absolutely, like I've studied, I love to study people. I love to study musicians. I've studied songs. I've studied, writing, as we do on the podcast. And so in some ways, our early voice is often an impression. And then as we slowly realize that we're much better at our own voice than trying to impersonate someone else, we find our voice. And I wonder if it is just a rite of passage that we all go through.
Yeah, I think that's very interesting. I think when you look at young children, they will often sound like their parents and mimic their parents until they develop a voice of their own, until they start answering back. Which is the turning.
Yeah.
Actually,
That's the moment. Yeah.
That's the moment, isn't it?
Find their own voice.
When they start stamping their feet and say, "No, Daddy, you're wrong." Actually, it's like, oh, okay, this day has come. Yeah, that's it, isn't it?
Yeah,
and the same thing happens to writers. I think there, you discover, and the write what you know advice is brilliant advice, but it's often misinterpreted. I remember being told that when I was 14 and thinking, what? I'm a 14-year-old know-nothing teenager. What? I'm not going to write. I want to write about spaceships and dragons and magic and stuff like that. But of course, the write what you know is the way to interpret that is to say, write what you're passionate about. Write with your voice. Write with my voice about dragons. I shouldn't try to be like David Eddings or Tolkien or Ursula Le Guin. I should put my own voice into, and that's what I did with End of Magic, and that's what I've done with the Woodville books. And so it is a question of putting your own unique stamp, your own voice on those ideas, which is why with the wonders of self-publishing, we will see, there's no gatekeepers between you and putting your voice out there and getting yourself heard.
It's easier to write as well. It's easier to write when you have immersed yourself in it, when you know it. You don't, you can build the imagination on top of the foundation of what you already know. But when you know it, you can write with conviction, you can write with authenticity. And I think that makes for a richer story.
Yeah, I mean, you say it's easier. I mean, one of the worrying things is that thing of putting your head above the parapet and saying, look, this is me. This is who I am. And you put that on the page, and that can be that can lead to all kinds of self-doubt and self-editing and kind of, do I really want to put this out there about myself? Do I really want to be this honest about this thing that I've been, or that I don't like talking about, but I want to put it on the page? And there's a fear that comes with that. And the fascinating thing to me is the more of that, because I've got this with Unwelcome, the movie that is in post-production at the moment. It's probably the most personal thing I've written. I mean, it's about goblins and supernatural.
Link.
But the couple in that film and what they go through is a massively exaggerated version of something that Claire and I have gone through, and it's very, very personal. And I said to her, "You okay with this going out there?" And no one will know unless they listen to this podcast, of course. But yeah, but it was, and it's interesting. I was talking with the director. We were doing EPK stuff, which is electronic press kit, and John and I did we got members of the BXP team and members of the Academy to send in questions. So that's another little perk. So they're going to be on maybe a making of DVD or Blu-ray or whatever.
Oh, yeah.
And we answered their questions on this sofa here. And John made the point, he said the first draft of the script he wasn't that impressed with. And he urged me to put more of myself in it, to put more of because he knew it was there, and I think he instinctively knew I was holding something back. So he encouraged me to put more of the personal, specific stuff in there, and that specificity. Oh, I said that first time.
Actually, you win an award for that.
Oh, I can't do it again. But that thing suddenly had a universality to it. Yeah. So I think that's a big lesson to learn. The things you think, well, no one's going to be interested in this. Actually, we might be totally fascinated by it.
If you've experienced the emotion of something and you write about it, it connects emotionally with the reader. I'm convinced 100% of that. Something which I learned early on in songwriting. Like if you want to write a song which connects with people, write a universal emotion, something which really people have experienced on one level or other. It's not identical to you, but they'll have experienced it on one level or another. Something going back though, Mark, you said about this idea of putting your head above the parapet and the fears that people have of putting themselves into their stories too much. That was one of the questions that came up in my recent coaching session on the Academy. We do a life coaching session live. Mark does one as well on craft coaching. I do life coaching. So every 2 weeks you get like an hour of that. But that very question came up, and it was absolutely mind-blowing because it was holding somebody back of actually really writing their book, because they had all this amazing stuff inside them they desperately wanted to express. But their biggest fear was, what if I put it on the page? And what came out of that particular session in the Academy, and we've recorded it. That's the thing about the Academy. If you come into the Academy, you get all the recordings of everything we've previously done. But it said, and I said to her, it's a bit like being an actor on stage. You learn your lines and you try to remember them. But if you forget a line, as long as you cover it up, no one actually knows in the audience that you've forgotten a line, right? You might be gutted, like, oh, I forgot that line. No one else knows, and they're completely oblivious to it. Now, the question is, how many people actually know your true inner thoughts? I used the example of Mr. and Mrs., the game show. Do you remember that, Mark, from years ago?
We've got the board game, and it starts more arguments than anything else in this house. So we banned it. Yeah.
Wow. So for anyone who hasn't heard of Mr. and Mrs., I always remember it was like an afternoon where somebody's put in a cubicle with headphones on, and then they're asked, I think, 10 or 15 questions about their husband or wife that they've been married to for 50 years. What's their favorite meal? And they win a prize if they manage to guess, more than the other contestants. But the thing that absolutely blows me away is how even people that have lived together for 50 years still don't know everything about their partner. In fact, they now say that answering 15 questions on Facebook, Facebook can know more about you than your closest person in your life, which is pretty scary. That's artificial intelligence for you. But I digress. The point of saying all this was, when you write a book and you put yourself into it, it's fiction. So who knows what is actually really what you're experiencing, thinking, has happened in your life, and what is stuff you're making up. People don't know. But most people don't. So unless you actually reveal it to the world and say, actually, yeah, on page 67, that was me, that happened in my life. It's fiction to everyone else. So don't let that hold you back. Go for it. Use it. Right? Write it out on the page. Get it out of you, and know that it's up to you as to whether you reveal that in the real world.
Yeah, the flip side of that. And just for American viewers, Mr. and Mrs. in the States was known as the Newlywed Game.
So the Newlywed Game.
Same format.
Same thing, yeah.
But the flip side of that is, if you write a novel about a serial killer and it's uncannily accurate, you are going to have people who will assume. So, that's all part of the fun of being an author, is people will come up to you and assume that I've been involved in a robot invasion or stuff like that. So,
you just never know, right? You just never know. But no. So yeah, go for it, everyone. Don't hold back. Don't feel precious about writing things. And remember, people won't know. They will not know. It's just a brilliant thing to go for. Now, what else jumped out for you, Mark?
I just thought this idea of balancing exposition and realism was something that, again, it comes with practice, and it's something we talk about a lot on the Academy as well. I think barely a craft coaching session goes by without us having some sort of conversation about exposition. But yeah, that's it's interesting that came up, and it is a skill I think that writers need to get their heads around. Funnily enough, this week saw the 40th anniversary of Raiders of the Lost Ark. And again, long-term listeners will know that whenever we talk about exposition, I talk about that scene at the beginning of Raiders where the two Secret Service guys come to Indy. And that could have been like a James Bond scene where James walks in and M says, right, Bond, this is your mission. Here's the villain. Here's where you got to go. And here's what the stakes are, which is usually quite dry and boring. But the genius of Lawrence Kasdan's script is he completely subverts it. So these two guys come in and they get it wrong. And Indy corrects them. He says, no, this is what it's all about. And not only is it an elegant way of getting across exposition, but it shows his agency and shows us that he's the right man for the job, and he has his passion and excitement for it as well. So yeah, I love that. It's we do a lot of exposition chat over on the Academy. It's something we talk about an awful lot, and it's something that comes with a bit of experience, but it's always something that trips people up.
I think it's one of those things that you kind of, at one point it clicks. But then you need to keep honing it as a skill as well. So it's something to always be working on, no matter how long you've been writing. It's fascinating stuff. The one thing that really jumped out for me, Mark, that I loved, that Joe said, was when he started talking about how writing makes him feel better. In fact, he said, it makes me feel good. But then what I loved was his analogy where he talked about, one of my friends does a triathlon like an Ironman. And it's this discipline of working and training.
Yeah, you lost me there.
Right, so I think it's really fascinating to see how Joe kind of used the metaphor of triathlons and Ironman. And I think of people that go, I know a lot of people listening. You probably go out and do your 1K run, your 5K run. You might be bonkers and do 10K, but you kind of get into your stride, and it kind of becomes a little bit addictive because of the kind of dopamine effect of once you feel the goodness that it does for you, you want to keep doing it and you want more of it. And if you can get to that stage with writing, where despite, and it's like running, there are times where you hit a hill and it's really difficult. There are days you wake up and you don't want to go out in the rain with a cold and busy things that you should be doing. But so it's a really great metaphor, and I love this idea. But really, this idea of writing makes me feel good, and I think underlying everything, no matter how hard or bad you think your writing might have been on a particular day, the reason why we keep showing up to write every day is because it does make us feel good in the big picture of things. In the long term, it gives us a sense of purpose. We're creating every day. We're writing something down. We're making magic on a page, and I think it's really important to remember that, especially during the difficult days.
Let me show you something. So I've taken to handwriting. So I sort of alternate from, and this is transformed how I write. I love it. And so I woke up this morning, first had breakfast, then come straight in this room and start writing. And I got my character, this is for book 3 of the Woodville books, I got my character in a situation I had no idea how she was going to get out of it. Genuinely no idea. And what I do is I essentially just start free writing, and it's like a conversation with myself. And whereas normally I'd have sat at the laptop, you've got that winking cursor, glaring at you going, come on.
What you got? What you got for me?
No, you can't do it, can you? So whereas this, I'm just going, okay, so I've written, and here are the options, and we could do this, and we could do that, and blah, blah, blah. And when I get to here, you see I've highlighted that. It's like, boom, got it. It was like a page, and then I got it. I sussed it. And then 4 more pages, handwritten. Wow. And so tomorrow, I'll be on the laptop when I get up, and I'll have that there, and I will translate this scrawl into something that vaguely resembles a chapter. And it's the most fun I've had writing a book. And I'm using it for a script as well, because normally scripts I go straight to laptop, but I'm using it for that too. And I know we had Joe Hill on here talking about how he handwrites, and it just exercises a different part of your brain. But just since I've started doing this, it's like coming out of hypnosis when I finished writing. I'll have a couple of hours in the morning. I come out and it's like, whoa, okay, got to deal with the real world now. But yeah, it is definitely my happy place.
I've always said that there is a direct connection between thought and ink. I mean, really, when you think about tapping on a keyboard, I mean, I'm a big, that's what I do all day basically. But I always go back. I mean, here's my bookmark. Always go back to writing every single day. There's something about the art of writing. The thing I love about it is when if you're not the best touch typer in the world, you don't have to worry about that. You don't have to look up and go, oh, I misspelt that word. There's something about the direct connection, the complete flow from your imagination to the end of your pen or pencil, whatever you use. And I must admit, I'm becoming more and more of a handwriter. And even the other day, I've started within this book. I actually haven't. This is a really cool idea, actually. If you haven't done this, get yourself an index at the front of your book. Page number all of your notepad books if they don't come page numbered. It's using actually a technique I've been using for a number of years by using a bullet journal, which I absolutely love. If you want to know more about that, I talk about it in the academy. But page number everything, and then put an index at the beginning of the book. And then as you just write things, just reference on the index, so you can find things really easy. So what I found the other day is I was in Scrivener, and there was a note in there saying, I talk more about this in my bullet journal, volume 7, page 72. When would I have ever found that? And I was like, oh my gosh, yeah, I wrote about this. I keep finding, before I used to find, I've already gone over this somewhere else. And I go to my bullet journals, I pick off volume 7, turn to page 72, and wallop, there is like a complete thought process of these ideas, which is absolutely relevant for what I needed in that moment. I thought, I've already thought all this through, and it was a melding of what I'd created on that day, plus something I'd written a few months back.
That's cool, because it's slightly different my one, because generally what goes on in here by hand is on the laptop the next day. Although there are things like I've stuck little post-it notes in for stuff that I might want to refer back to. So I'm slightly more clunky when it comes to that. I tell you what, life-changing. Create a little index, number your pages. I just do odd pages. I don't number them all. I just do every odd page. And then create a little index, which just, I mean, literally, this is my journal. So it's got like every single day that I wrote. It's got my monthly goals. It's got
ideas for books. It's got trackers, it's got logs, it's got this thing called Life Manual, which I'm working on right now. There's a lot of that. That's a big thing I'm working on right now. Really excited about that. But it's all here. So if I ever want to go in and take anything about the Life Manual, I can see all the places where I've, even though it's all randomly scattered like my brain is during the day. I mean, it's like whatever comes in. But indexing, look into bullet journaling if you've not used it before. I love it. And I'm sure people will going to tweet about this and go, I do bullet journal. I love bullet journaling. It's great.
If anyone's listening to this in the distant future, sort of 150 years from now, and they're going, oh, that's the journal? This would be like the Dead Sea Scrolls or something. Look, everyone gather around. It's on video. Come and look at it. He's holding it up on the screen. And then they step outside and there's a giant statue of Mr. DeVoe standing over them because how he changed the world.
Covered in seagull crap. But you know what? Weirdly enough, this morning, Mark, I was reading about the beginnings of Amazon. I'm reading a really fun story called The Story of Everything. And because I'm just fascinated, and I've been involved in technology and the internet since the early days. And it talks about the day that they got their first book sale on Amazon, and they have this bell that they used to ring, ding, every time they sold a book. And apparently by 2 weeks, they had to chuck the bell away because it would just be a constant ding, 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 ding. But just going back to the very beginnings of something and seeing the excitement of, we sold a book. And Bezos was down in this tiny little room where they were packing everything. They were working through the night to try and keep up with orders. And you do think, all these things, including every book you're writing, every person listening to this, starts off as a small idea, a little, little thing that pops into your brain. And by the end of it, you've got this incredible piece of work that you've created. So again, remember that this is all part of the journey and the stages of us creating something, which is really important. It's if you're writing it, it's meant to be written. That's how I feel. Someone out there, or lots of people out there, are waiting for that book. So get on with it. Get writing.
Yeah.
Get writing.
Listen to us. Get writing.
Yeah, start your Iron Man today. Brilliant stuff. And I also like to, Joe, just briefly before we dive into social media, I like the fact that, he does try to write every day. He had a word count of 1,000 to 1,500 words. I think it's really fascinating, though. We've got the 200 word a day challenge, which for a lot of people think, such a small amount to write. But actually, when you listen to these authors, there's rarely someone who writes 5,000 or 10,000 words a day. Most authors are pushing out 500 words a day, 1,000 words if they're, really going for it, or 200 words. So, it's not like we have to aspire to get to this place where we're writing thousands of words. It's just that consistency of writing.
Yep.
Daily.
It's that habit.
So get on it. 200wordchallenge.com. If you've not joined yet, get involved.
Cool.
Excellent stuff. What's happening on social media this week, Mark? You mentioned about an interesting queeve.
This is amazing, and it's been on Deadline and Variety and all those kind of big Hollywood news outlets, but. Queeve, who we love dearly, and he writes we've got him on the podcast a couple of times, most recently for his book Stranger Times, but he's been self-publishing the Dublin series, which started as a trilogy and is now, I think, 11 books, including prequels and in-between and spin-offs and all kinds of other stuff. But they've been optioned by Chris Addison. Now, Chris Addison, people will know from
Mock the Week.
In the Thick of It. Yeah, exactly. And Americans will know him from Veep because he's one of the writers, and I think he's directed stuff on Veep as well. He's also on FX and Sky is a show called Breeders that he's created as well. But he is going to adapt Queeve's Dublin trilogy as a series for television, which is just amazing. And it's great because it says, look, the series, which is published by McFory Inc. and has sold over 500,000 copies, comprises 5 books. So it's a trilogy with 5 books. Well done, Queeve. So he's a man with one of those faces. The Day That Never Comes, Last Orders, there's a prequel, Angels in the Moonlight, and Dead Man Sins, which just came out this week. So that's amazing news. And Queeve is in the Bestseller Experiment Facebook group, which if you're a top tier patron, you'll get to be in that group with Queeve and all sorts of other incredible and amazing people. So huge congrats to Queeve on that news.
That's brilliant, Queeve. Absolutely brilliant. flying the flag.
Yeah, absolutely. Other good news, Gavin G. Smith, another person we've had on, another writer we've had on the podcast a few times as well. He says he's sort of, I love Gavin because he sort of glumly announced that his book was a bestseller. He's tagged us in the tweet. He says, I feel compelled to report that his book, Spec Ops Z, which is a kind of zombie military mashup, high adventure, high octane action, it is an Amazon bestseller on both sides of the pond. So he's like quietly let us know this amazing book, which has been around for a while. And this is one of these things as well. You know, if you've got a book that you feel, oh, it didn't sell in the first week, so it's done, it's finished, it's over. No. These books are new to all sorts of people. It had a book bub. Gavin's book, Spec Ops Z, had a book bub this week, and it shot up the charts, and it's staying up there as well. So big congrats to Gavin on that.
Brilliant. Well done, Gavin. That's fantastic.
And not least, last but by no means least, Steve Gowland, who, again, if you're following the 200 words a day hashtag, is a regular contributor. His second book, Covenant of Shadows, has been released, and he sent us a copy, which I've added to the Bestseller Experiment alumni library. I've had to have a complete reshuffle of my bookshelves because we've now got so many books from people who've heard something on the podcast, been inspired by someone on the podcast, that I've had to have a complete reshuffle of the shelves because I actually run out of room. So big congrats to Steve and everyone who's listened to the podcast and had a book published because of something they heard or inspired by, or just, you know, it's just amazing. Absolutely amazing.
That is brilliant. That's going to be a difficult conversation though, isn't it, Mark? With the missus about the extension.
Yes, the library. Yeah, I'll break it to her somehow. I think as long as she, her books are allowed in there, then that's fine. So absolutely. I think she'll be okay with that. Yeah.
Fantastic stuff. And thank you to everyone. We love it. We love hearing about the journey that you've had with your book, and we really do appreciate. I mean, this just started off as a bit of fun with somebody sending us their book that they'd written. And Mark collecting them. But if you, if you've had an interesting journey with the podcast and your book, write and tell us about how the podcast has affected your writing, if it's helped. We had one this week. Oh my gosh. Someone in the Academy said that because of the Academy, they didn't give up with writing and they've just been published for the first time, which we know in everyone's journey is an incredible milestone. It gives you belief. It gives you the ability to know that this can happen. And she was there writing to everyone else saying, don't give up, keep going, dreams can come true. And so it was so lovely to read that. So, congratulations as well for that.
In fact, next week's episode, very, very special episode. We've got someone who, again, sent us a copy of a book, which I'm looking at now, looks absolutely amazing, has had one hell of a journey. And we're going to be talking to that author next week. And that's going to be a very special episode. So do hang around for that one.
Absolutely. Don't miss it. Excellent stuff. Now, if you want to get in contact with us, there are many different ways on social media and the website, aren't there, Mark?
Yeah, come to bestsellerexperiment.com. There is a contact tab there. You can drop us a line. If you come to Facebook, we're Bestseller Experiment, and Twitter and Instagram is @bestsellerxp. Message us, drop us a line. Let us know how you're getting on. Subscribe, rate, and review. Don't ever miss an episode. Subscribe on your podcatcher. Give us a star rating if you've enjoyed this. And big thanks, as always, to our editors, Dave and JD, whose lives we have made very interesting these last few weeks. So.
Yeah, with... all kinds of latency issues across the pond, should we say. But anyway, the magic of what you're hearing, you can see they do an amazing job. Thanks again, guys. And if you would like to join the 200-word challenge and you want to start getting your writing back on track, it's 200wordchallenge.com, 200wordchallenge.com. And if you want to join us in the Academy, if you want to be coached by me and Mark, if you want access to just an incredible array of resources that we've got, and most importantly, you want accountability and you want to be continually inspired by us and your fellow academates, then join the Academy. It is life-changing for many, many people. So do come and check it out. It's academy.bestsellerexperiment.com. Join us for the webinar next week, or this week if you're listening to this on the 21st of June. And with all that said, Mark, it is definitely a goodbye from Mark 1.
And a goodbye from Mark 2. Goodbye.
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 Goodbye.